What if the single bloodiest month of Russia's war in Ukraine didn't happen in 2022 or 2023, but just a few weeks ago? And what if that record-breaking toll is already forcing Vladimir Putin to consider a decision he has spent nearly 4 years desperately trying to avoid? Imagine losing more than 42,000 soldiers in a single month. Not over a year, not over an entire campaign, but in 31 days of fighting. That is the number Ukraine's general staff just reported for Russian personnel losses in July 2026. And it represents something Ukrainian officials themselves flagged as genuinely significant the moment they released it. This wasn't just a high month. It was, according to the general staff's own comparison, the highest monthly Russian personnel loss total recorded at any point in 2026. By the time I walk you through exactly how that number was calculated, how it compares to every other month this year, and what it's already forcing Vladimir Putin to consider doing in response, you are going to understand why some Ukrainian officials are treating July 2026 as a genuine inflection point in the human cost of this war. Before we dive in, if you find this kind of careful, sourced analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button and tap the like icon. Share this with one person who still thinks Russia can sustain this pace indefinitely. The numbers tell a very different story. Let me start with exactly what Ukraine's general staff reported and when, because the sourcing here matters. On August 1st, 2026, Ukraine's general staff announced that Russian personnel losses for the month of July had totaled 42,860, described explicitly as the highest monthly total recorded so far in 2026. That figure surpassed the previous high point of the year, 39,290 personnel losses recorded in June, which had itself been notable at the time. Averaged across the full year through July, Russian losses have run at approximately 34,000 personnel per month, according to the same general staff statistics, which means July's total came in roughly 25% above the year's own running average. A meaningful spike rather than simple statistical noise. The general staff also provided the broader annual context, reporting that Russia's cumulative personnel losses for the first 7 months of 2026 alone, January through July, totaled 238,650. That's the equivalent of an entire mid-sized city's population of soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or missing in just over half a calendar year, layered on top of everything Russia had already lost across the nearly 3 years of fighting that preceded it. Now let's put that monthly figure inside the full cumulative picture, because the scale of the total war losses is what gives the July spike its real weight. As of the most recent general staff reporting this week, covering losses through August 7th and 8th, Russia's total cumulative personnel losses since the start of the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022, stand at approximately 1,455,000. Walk that number backward across the summer and you can see the trajectory clearly. Roughly 1,444,000 as of July 1st, roughly 1,447,000 by July 11th, roughly 1,448,000 by July 16th. Roughly 1,449,000 by July 23rd, roughly 1,450,000 by July 29th, and now past 1,455,000 as of this week. That's a war that has cost Russia's own military, by Ukraine's own daily tracked accounting, somewhere in the range of 50,000 additional personnel losses in barely more than a month. A pace of attrition that, if it held steady across an entire year, would put annual Russian losses somewhere in the vicinity of 500,000 people. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are committed to bringing you clear, fact-based analysis on the stories that shape our world. Your support makes this content possible. Share this with someone who still thinks Russia's losses are exaggerated. It's worth pausing on the equipment losses that accompanied the personnel toll because casualties never arrive in isolation. They arrive alongside the hardware that was supporting the soldiers who became casualties, and the equipment figures from the same reporting period tell a consistent story. On individual days throughout early August, Ukraine's general staff reported Russian equipment losses running in the range of 55 to 80 artillery systems, several tanks, and well over 1,000 drones destroyed in a single 24-hour window, alongside the personnel figures we've already discussed. Across the cumulative total since February 2022, Russian tank losses alone stand at over 12,000 units, according to the general staff's own running tally. That equipment attrition matters directly to the personnel story, because a Russian assault force that's lost the armor and artillery support it would traditionally rely on to reduce casualties during an offensive push is forced into exactly the kind of tactic we've already documented around Pokrovsk specifically. Small dispersed infantry infiltration groups moving forward largely on foot, without the armored and artillery cover that would historically have reduced the human cost of that advance. Fewer tanks and fewer artillery systems supporting each assault wave is in practical terms one of the structural reasons personnel losses climb, even as territorial gains stay marginal. Exactly the 7 kilometers in a year pattern this channel. Documented in the Pokrovsk sector specifically. Let's talk about where in this war that cost is actually concentrating, because July's record-setting numbers didn't happen in a vacuum. We've covered extensively how the Pokrovsk sector has absorbed a wildly disproportionate share of Russia's total offensive activity throughout this entire summer. Ukrainian officials describing it as accounting for something close to a third of all combat clashes recorded anywhere along this war's 1,000-kilometer front line and roughly half of all Russian precision-guided bomb strikes. We walked through the daily numbers directly. 23 to 49 Russian assault actions repelled in that single sector on any given day throughout June and July, each one costing Russia dozens of casualties, according to Ukraine's own daily reporting. Multiply that kind of daily attrition across an entire month in a single sector, alone against an estimated Russian troop concentration of 170,000 in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohorod area specifically, and you start to see exactly where a chunk of July's record 42,000 figure actually came from. Russia has been feeding manpower into that specific pocket at a rate resembling the worst months of Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And July appears to be the month that pattern finally showed up clearly in the aggregate national statistics, rather than just the sector-specific daily reports. And let's also put July's number in historical context against the full arc of this war, because a single month's figure lands very differently depending on whether you're comparing it to the war's opening phase or to the grinding attritional character it's settled into since. The early weeks of the full-scale invasion in 2022 produced intense but comparatively brief spikes tied to specific large-scale operations. The initial assault on Kiev, the battle for Mariupol, the fighting around Kharkiv. What July 2026 represents is different in kind. Not a single dramatic operation producing a casualty spike, but a sustained multi-front grinding tempo concentrated overwhelmingly in one sector, Pokrovsk. That alone accounts for something close to a third of all combat activity nationally, producing the single highest monthly total of an entire year, already characterized by historically elevated losses compared to the war's earlier phases. That distinction matters for understanding what kind of war this has become. A casualty spike tied to a specific offensive operation tends to recede once that operation concludes one way or another. A casualty spike that emerges from months of sustained grinding attrition in a single fixed sector, the pattern we've already documented in detail around Pokrovsk specifically, tends to persist for as long as both sides continue judging that sector worth the cost of continuing to fight over. Here's where I need to be genuinely careful and precise, because this is exactly the kind of story where sloppy sourcing does real damage to the credibility of everything else being reported. And this particular topic has more competing credible estimates attached to it than almost any other number in this entire war. Ukraine's general staff figure of roughly 1,455,000 cumulative losses is not the only serious estimate out there. And it's important to understand why the other estimates differ, rather than simply picking whichever number sounds most dramatic. President Zelensky himself, in an interview on July 31st, gave a notably higher figure, telling an interviewer that Russia had suffered 1,600,000 total losses, including approximately 700,000 deaths specifically, a figure meaningfully above his own military's general staff. Daily tracking. British intelligence, in a separate assessment reported in May 2026, put cumulative Russian deaths specifically, not total casualties, including wounded, at almost 500,000 since the start of the full-scale invasion. And an entirely independent effort conducted by the Russian language outlets Meduza and Mediazona, using verified by-name casualty lists, cross-referenced against inheritance records, court filings, and other public documentation, arrived at a considerably lower figure for confirmed deaths specifically, estimating roughly 261,000 killed by the end of 2025, plus another 90,000 declared dead or missing through legal processes for a combined total in the low 350,000 range. That's a genuinely wide spread, and I want to walk through why these numbers diverge so much rather than just noting that they do, because the explanation actually matters for understanding what each figure is measuring. Ukraine's general staff cumulative figure uses the standard NATO-style casualty definition, which counts killed, wounded, missing, and captured personnel together as a single combined figure. British intelligence's figure of roughly 500,000 is specifically measuring confirmed deaths, a narrower category by definition, which means it's not actually contradicting Ukraine's broader casualty figure so much as measuring a different, smaller subset of it. And the Meduza and Mediazona by name count, the lowest of the group, relies exclusively on documented, individually verifiable Russian deaths, a methodology that produces an inherently conservative floor since it can only count deaths that have left some kind of public paper trail. Inheritance filings, obituaries, court declarations of death, missing exactly the soldiers whose deaths never generate that specific kind of documentable record in a country that, worth remembering, has not officially disclosed its own casualty figures since September 2022, when Moscow last acknowledged for that single and final time a death toll of 5,937. We are now deep into this analysis, and if you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the full picture. That is exactly why we need your help. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video on your social media. The more people who see this, the more informed the conversation becomes. Every share makes a difference. Let's talk about how independent journalists have actually managed to build a casualty count at all, given that Moscow itself has stayed almost entirely silent on the subject. Because the methodology behind the Meduza and Mediazona figures deserves real credit and real scrutiny in equal measure. Rather than relying on any official government disclosure, that joint investigative effort has spent years cross-referencing regional Russian media obituaries, social media posts from grieving family members, court filings related to inheritance and death benefits, and municipal cemetery records across Russia's vast geography, piecing together a by-name, individually documented casualty count from the bottom up, rather than waiting for any top-down government figure that Moscow has shown no intention of ever providing. That approach produces what's almost certainly an undercount relative to Russia's true losses, since it can only capture deaths that generate some form of public record. And soldiers from more remote regions, from ethnic minority communities, or from private military contractor formations outside Russia's formal armed forces structure are likely underrepresented in exactly the kind of documentation this methodology depends on. But it also produces something the other estimates in this story can't offer: a floor. A minimum verified number below which the true casualty count almost certainly cannot fall, because every single name on that list represents an individually documented, cross-referenced death rather than a statistical estimate. Even that conservative floor in the low 350,000 range for confirmed deaths through the end of 2025 represents a scale of loss that would be considered catastrophic for almost any modern military fighting, almost any other conflict in the post-Cold War era. Sit with that. Last detail for a second, because it's the actual context that makes every other number in this story make sense. Russia's own government has not published an official casualty figure in nearly 4 years of continuous high-intensity war. Every single number we've just walked through, Ukraine's daily general staff tracking, Zelensky's higher personal estimate, British intelligence's assessment, and the independent Russian journalists working from public documentation, exists specifically because Moscow itself has chosen not to provide one. That silence is itself a data point. And it's a familiar one to anyone who's followed this channel's coverage of this war throughout the year. The same pattern of narrowing and non-response we've documented from Russian officials after nearly every strike on Russian territory applied here to the most consequential statistic of the entire war. How many of its own soldiers Russia has actually lost fighting it? There's a human dimension to Ukraine's own losses worth including here too, because an honest accounting of casualties in this war cannot responsibly focus exclusively on one side. Zelensky, in the same set of late July remarks where he discussed Russian losses, gave a rare public figure for Ukraine's own toll. Approximately 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed and roughly 400,000 wounded since the start of the full-scale invasion. Kiev has historically kept its own casualty figures far more tightly controlled than its reporting on Russian losses, releasing them only sporadically, roughly once a year, according to Zelensky's own public statements. A policy driven by understandable wartime, morale, and operational security considerations. Ukraine's own military command has separately indicated some success in reducing its personnel loss rate, with then Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stating in January that Ukraine had managed to reduce personnel losses by roughly 13% over the preceding year, though without providing the underlying figures that would let outside analysts verify that specific claim independently. Whatever the precise numbers on the Ukrainian side, and they remain considerably less publicly documented than the Russian figures, the scale of loss on both sides of this front line is a reminder that the arithmetic we've walked through today describes a war that is extracting an enormous human cost from both nations simultaneously, not a one-sided story of Russian suffering alone. Let's talk about what July's specific spike is already doing to Russian domestic military policy, because this is where the casualty numbers stop being an abstract accounting exercise and start shaping real near-term decisions inside the Kremlin. Zelensky, citing Ukrainian intelligence reporting, warned publicly on July 25th that Vladimir Putin is, in his words, preparing the conditions for expanding mobilization. That warning came alongside specific enlistment figures Zelensky provided the same day that Russia had enlisted 221,000 people into its military so far in 2026, while sustaining, as of that point in late July, nearly 225,000 personnel losses for the year. Read that pair of numbers together carefully because it's the actual arithmetic problem sitting underneath every mobilization decision the Kremlin has to weigh. Enlistment through late July running at roughly 221,000, losses through the same period running at roughly 225,000. Russia's own recruitment pipeline, as of the moment Zelensky made that statement, was not even keeping pace with the rate at which Russian soldiers were being killed, wounded, captured, or reported missing. That's before July's own record-setting 42,000 figure gets fully layered into the annual total. A month that, based on the trajectory we've just walked through, likely widened that recruitment versus loss gap considerably further rather than narrowing it. There's a data point specific to Ukraine's own long-range strike campaign that connects directly to this recruitment versus loss arithmetic, and it's worth including because it shows the pressure isn't confined to the grinding infantry fighting around Pokrovsk alone. Separate, reporting on Ukrainian drone strike effectiveness, specifically covering the period from December 2025 through April 2026, found that Ukrainian drone operations alone had inflicted 156,000 confirmed Russian casualties in that 5-month window, a figure that reportedly surpassed the 148,000 new recruits Russia brought into its military over that exact same period. That's not the general infantry attrition happening in trench fighting along the Pokrovsk axis. That's specifically drone warfare, the same category of capability we've spent the entire year documenting across naval strikes in the Black Sea, long-range strikes into Russia's industrial interior, and the systematic campaign against Russian air defense infrastructure, inflicting more Russian casualties in a 5-month stretch than Russia's entire recruitment pipeline could replace over that same window. Layer that finding. On top of Zelensky's separate July 25th enlistment versus losses arithmetic, and you get a genuinely consistent picture across 2 entirely different data sources and 2 entirely different 5 to 7 month windows. Russia's ability to replace its own battlefield losses through voluntary and contract enlistment has been running at a deficit against the actual casualty rate for a meaningful stretch of this year, well before July's own record-breaking total ever got tallied. That deficit is precisely why mobilization has become the specific policy question hanging over every one of these casualty statistics, because it's the option available to Moscow the moment voluntary recruitment genuinely fails. A second broad mobilization wave carries real domestic political risk for a government that has spent nearly 4 years deliberately structuring its recruitment strategy, specifically to avoid needing one. If Ukrainian intelligence assessments are correct, that Moscow is genuinely laying groundwork for exactly that step, it tells you the arithmetic gap between voluntary enlistment and actual battlefield losses has become severe enough that the Kremlin is now weighing a politically costly option it spent years successfully avoiding. We are nearing the end of this deep dive, and I want to ask you for one last thing. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update on this developing story. Share this video with your friends and family. The more people who understand what is happening beneath the surface, the better prepared we all are for what comes next. Let's also examine the financial incentive structure Russia has relied on to avoid a second broad mobilization. Since the backlash that followed the September 2022 partial mobilization, Russia has leaned overwhelmingly on volunteer contract recruitment, offering signing bonuses that, in many Russian regions, represent multiple years of average local salary paid, upfront alongside monthly combat pay that dramatically exceeds typical civilian wages in the economically depressed regions, where recruitment has been most heavily targeted. That financial model works in the sense that it has sustained Russia's recruitment numbers without the visible domestic backlash a broad conscription order would produce. But it depends entirely on a steady flow of new volunteers willing to accept those terms. A flow that, according to Zelensky's own July 25th figures, was already running behind the pace of Russian losses even before July's own record month got tallied. Every month that gap widens, the financial incentives required to keep attracting sufficient new volunteers have to climb further, straining the same regional and federal budgets already stretched by the broader costs of sustaining this war. There's another piece of that recruitment picture worth including because it connects directly to a story we've already covered in detail this month. Alongside the domestic enlistment and potential mobilization questions, Zelensky also stated in the same set of July remarks that Moscow is preparing to receive an additional 30,000 North Korean troops to support its war against Ukraine. We've already documented on this channel how North Korea's military relationship with Russia has escalated in stages throughout this war. From an initial deployment of roughly 10 to 12,000 troops sent to help repel Ukraine's Kursk incursion in late 2024, absorbing casualties in the thousands according to Western assessments, to the more recent integration of a dedicated North Korean missile unit complete with 6 mobile launchers and 120 KN-23 ballistic missiles directly into a Russian brigade structure in Voronezh Oblast. Just this past week, a reported additional 30,000 North Korean troops would represent, by a significant margin, the largest single expansion of that foreign troop relationship since the war began. And it fits precisely the pattern we've just walked through. A Russian recruitment and replacement pipeline that, by Zelensky's own July 25th arithmetic, was already running behind its own battlefield loss rate before July's record month even got tallied. Now, apparently looking outside Russia's own population for the additional manpower, its domestic recruitment strategy has struggled to generate on its own. It's worth naming, too, what a genuinely broad second mobilization order would actually mean for how the rest of the world assesses Russia's staying power in this war. The 2022 partial mobilization triggered a well-documented surge of Russian citizens, disproportionately drawn from the country's educated urban population, leaving the country specifically to avoid conscription. A domestic political cost the Kremlin has spent every year since working to avoid repeating. A decision to order a second broad mobilization wave in 2026 would signal to Russian citizens and to the outside world simultaneously that the volunteer and foreign troop recruitment model has genuinely reached its limits. That Russia's own domestic population, even with the strongest financial incentives Moscow has been willing to offer, is no longer generating enough new soldiers to sustain current operational tempo across sectors like Pokrovsk without resorting to the more visible, more politically costly step it's spent years successfully sidestepping. Whether that decision actually arrives in the coming months, or whether Moscow continues managing the recruitment gap through expanded foreign troop integration and incremental financial incentive increases, instead is itself one of the more consequential open questions hanging over the rest of this year. Let's be honest about the limits of what any of these figures can actually tell us with certainty, because that honesty is what separates serious analysis from wartime propaganda, regardless of which side produces it. Ukraine's general staff has an obvious institutional incentive to report enemy losses as high as the available evidence can plausibly support, a dynamic true of every military reporting enemy casualties in every war in recorded history. And it would be naive to treat any single day's general staff figure as an independently audited, forensically verified count rather than an operational estimate produced by a government fighting for its own survival. At the same time, the consistency of the general staff's daily reporting methodology across more than 4 years of continuous publication, the rough directional alignment between Ukraine's cumulative figures and the separate independently sourced estimates from British intelligence, and from Meduza and Mediazona's by-name Russian casualty tracking, even accounting for the different casualty categories each one measures, and the specific corroborating arithmetic Zelensky provided around enlistment falling behind losses, all point in the same general direction rather than contradicting each other outright. None of that amounts to certainty about the exact figure. It amounts to reasonable confidence that Russia's personnel losses in this war are genuinely enormous, genuinely accelerating through the summer of 2026, specifically, and genuinely severe enough to be shaping real consequential decisions inside the Kremlin about mobilization and foreign troop reliance. There's a broader CSIS assessment worth including here as a final data point because it frames this story at the scale it actually deserves. A study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, released July 1st, 2026, found that combined losses from both sides of this war, Russian and Ukrainian casualties added together, had exceeded 2 million people since the fighting began in February 2022. 2 million. That figure spanning both militaries dwarfs the total military casualties the United States sustained across the entirety of the Second World War. And it's been reached in a conflict that, as of this reporting, shows no clear sign of concluding on any predictable near-term timeline. Every monthly statistic we've walked through today, July's record, 42,000, June's 39,000, the running 34,000 average, is a component piece of that 2 million figure. And every single unit inside it represents a person, a family, a name that, on the Russian side specifically, Moscow's own government has shown no inclination to ever publicly acknowledge in full. Widen the lens for a moment because July's casualty spike connects directly to nearly every other story we've covered throughout this year. We've documented the grinding sector-specific attrition around Pokrovsk, an 8-to-1 troop disparity by Zelensky's own account, absorbing a third of all combat activity along the entire front. We've documented the systematic Ukrainian campaign against Russian air defense infrastructure. We've documented the naval strikes in the Black Sea that have functionally pushed the Russian fleet out of its western operating areas. We've documented the long-range drone strikes into Russia's industrial interior. Every one of those threads connects back to the same central arithmetic question we've walked through today. Can Russia sustain its current operational tempo across all of those fronts simultaneously when its own recruitment pipeline is already running behind its battlefield loss rate even before July's record month gets tallied? The answer to that question will shape the rest of this war, and July's record casualty figure has made it considerably harder for Kremlin planners to keep deferring. What do you think happens next? Does Moscow order a second broad mobilization that risks domestic backlash? Does it lean even harder on North Korean troops to fill the gap? Or does it simply accept a slower operational tempo across the front as it struggles to reconstitute its forces? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.